6, we went to 38. We're capped by the town, we can't have more than that. So it's interesting for the town to hear some of these things for their plans, because they've asked for ways to how we can get affordable housing for the town first.
I'm Megan McDonough. Pioneer Valley Habitat for Humanity builds homes in Hampshire and Franklin counties, and we've been doing this now for 30 years. This is our 30th anniversary year, and we have 42 completed homes, and we have 4 currently under construction. The ones that are currently under construction are in Northampton. Most of the homes we've built have been sort of along more the central corridor of the two counties. So we've built in East Hampton, Amherst, Northampton, Montague, Greenfield, and Orange.
Tell us a little bit about governance. So who makes decisions, how they're made?
Sure. So the Valley Community Land Trust is a nonprofit organization governed by a board of directors. We strive to operate with consensus as our model. But the board of directors is made up of members of the trust, and membership of the trust is open to the public. So our board is currently mostly lessees, but the homeowner lessees. But there's certainly room, and in the past has included more non-lessee members of the organization.
And we're very similar back in '87 when they started out. But we're a for-profit company, but we file our taxes as a non-profit, as a club. We don't get paid taxes on that. We have a board of directors with 7 directors and officers, president, vice president, secretary, treasurer.
We're a nonprofit organization, a 501c3, and we have a board of directors that is in charge of making decisions, and they hire me, and we have other part-time staff that help implement that policy and direction. And we have, unlike these guys who are mostly residents on the board, we have mostly community members on the board. We have 1 former homeowner on our board, but we also provide financing to our home buyers. So while they're still, while we have a financial relationship, we don't have them on the board of directors.
So how do you create affordability?
Yeah, the land trust works a little differently than standard affordable housing models. There's no grants involved. There's no sort of investment that reduces the price of the home. The home I purchased was at a market appraisal value for the home itself. By leasing the land, we do not purchase the land, so we are more affordable by what we're not buying. The house is a market price, but it's more accessible. The land is more accessible because you're not buying land outright. You're paying a monthly lease to be on the land.
For us, keeping it affordable basically means keeping our expenses down. We're not an extravagant park. We don't have a swimming pool. We don't have playground. We don't have a lot of extra things. We have a pavilion. We offer an area for them to go if they want to, play charts or darts or something like that. We have had some success in getting money from community development block grants. We received one probably 20 years, 30 years ago near our infancy to upgrade our water lines and put fire hydrants in and water meters at each of the homes. And we're currently working with Greg Owen to look for money for replacing our septic system. So we try to keep it affordable by looking for any grants or any extra money that's out there, and just not being extravagant in our expenses. We keep it pretty simple.
Can I ask a really embarrassing question? What are the numbers? Like, what does affordable mean? I'm so sorry.
For us, our maintenance fee is $155 right now, and so that covers all of the taxes on the property. It covers all the tax for the whole loan. Covers mowing in the summer, plowing in the winter of the main roads, we feel it's affordable because our houses are somewhere in the vicinity of used. They run anywhere between $30,000 and $90,000.
Let's just go back there. What's an average house sale tax?
I don't know.
Just get, you know,
So I can speak from my experience. Our home was a modest 1,300 square feet, 30-year-old house. We paid about $110,000 for our home with a leasehold of 2 acres, which would be an equivalent value of say $50,000 or $60,000 that we didn't pay to have access to that land.
And where is it?
I live in Coleraine. We're spread out over Coleraine, Ashfield, Wendell, and Greenfield. So our properties vary. There are some larger houses. There are some smaller lots as well. There is actually more recently a much smaller home sold in Wendell for $30,000, but it needs a little bit of work and is a very small home. So it varies with us.
And the land lease?
So where I'm at with my 2 acres is about $100 a month currently. But the land lease fee is based on the total operational cost of the trust, averaged over time and divided amongst sort of equal shares for the size of our leaseholds. So it will vary over time and is likely to go down in the near future.
And the leases provide town water and town sewer?
If that is available. So one of the homes in Greenfield is where there is those systems available, but of the neighborhood I live in Coleraine, there is no public services available anyway. So we're all on our own independent wells and independent septic systems.
So let's go to Megan, and then we'll ask more questions.
So Pioneer Valley Habitat for Humanity uses some of the same strategies of having simple housing or modest housing. But we also are doing primarily new construction versus existing homes. So we raise funds from the community, we apply for grants, and we use volunteers in the construction of the homes. And we ask for donated materials. So we seek community support in the construction of the homes. And then when we sell the homes to people, we sell them with an affordable mortgage, which we have a couple different strategies for that, but historically, most of our homes were sold with a mortgage from Habitat for Humanity. So we actually acted as the bank as well as the developer and the person qualifying with them. So we set an income limit because we're getting these community resources into the project. We sell our homes to people who earn less than 60% of the median income in the area. And that ranges, depending on your family size, something like $33,000 to $48,000 a year. So we tend, and then we set a minimum income because they're still buying a house and having to pay a mortgage. So most of our homeowners earn more than $25,000 a year and less than $50,000 a year when they buy their home.
What's the average house price approved?
Yeah, between 100 and 150,000. But if you have zero interest, that makes a very different formula.
How does property ownership contribute or not contribute to affordability?
Yeah, so on the land trust, property ownership is not an option. So that immediately knocks off the big hurdle to purchasing a home. Like I said, our home was anywhere from $50,000 to $60,000 cheaper than it would have been if it came with the ownership of the 2 acres underneath it. There is sort of an assumption that if we live there long enough and our lease fees stayed high enough, we may over time pay the equivalent value of having purchased that 2 acres, but that's assuming we stay there for 30 plus years and all sorts of other variables.
I mentioned this Scott earlier, it's affordable for us to own because we don't have to pay for profit for somebody else. All of our profits go right back into the corporation, so we don't have, I think Scott was mentioning somebody, or somebody else I was talking to was an Amherst, their profit rate for leasing was like 40%. That's a lot of money for somebody else to be getting. We don't have to worry about that. It's, so that's our part. Just roll it over into the infrastructure of the park.
So typically, we are providing an opportunity for ownership to a low-income individual or family. That ownership of the land and housing, so we're giving access to ownership to people who wouldn't otherwise have that access. But because of the community support that goes into it, we put a deed restriction on the house that stays with the house, with the land in the house in perpetuity, that limits the resale price so that it'll be affordable to the next person when they go to buy. So our first homeowner is gaining equity with every mortgage payment, but they're not gonna get a windfall from market fluctuations. They're just gonna be able to get some increase and get back what they put in and sell it to someone else at an affordable price.
Okay, so I'll create a stack, raise your hands, one, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm interested in hearing from anyone here, and not just you three necessarily, about what are we, like, what are ideas for creating truly affordable housing? So affordable housing for people who make less than $25,000 a year, which is me and most of the people I know. Like, I would love to hear people's ideas, because I think that tying affordable housing with ownership does kind of limit who that's available to, because there's many people who that's never going to be within their means unless something drastically changes.
So I'll start with that. Is anyone on the panel want to answer?
I would just say yes. What we're, or at least my interpretation of what we're all doing is one slice of it, as opposed to everything that needs to happen.
So anyone else have an idea? How do you create affordability for people that live at the low end?
So I'm really glad to see that this room has actually got the public banking in it too, because I think the two are very much entwined. And I think that one of the avenues for the future for affordable housing and for keeping our investments in our communities comes from the idea of a public banking model. And so I'm interested in the financing. You talked about how you offer mortgages to you carry the mortgage, so you're a bank, and the land trust. Who pays for the leases? Who owns that? And what kind of when they trade, when they end, or they transfer ownership or transfer leasehold ownership, what kind of parameters are in place that protects the initial investment? Is there an opportunity to buy out? Is there an opportunity for somebody to come in or an entity to come in and offer market price, and like you can do, whether a municipality can do when you have a land protected under agricultural restrictions or conservation restrictions. The municipality can come in at the end and say, I'll buy that land, and then they have the first right to. So is there those kinds of checks and balances? What's in place? I'm interested in I really do believe that maintaining the money, the control of the money and the mortgages, the interest needs to come back into the community instead of going off to some, big corporate bank and protected somewhere in some other community. It's not being reinvested in our community. So I think that is one of the key. Financing is really important.
Yeah, there's a few things that I can speak to. So just sort of generally on the Valley Community Land Trust land, there's a variety of different situations of ownership and financing. The trust itself has operated as the bank and written mortgages for individual lessees. And the organization has sort of stewarded private loans through generous donors to the organization. Those have historically been very low interest to no interest loans. Certainly something that made it more accessible for my wife and I to be able to take out the loan with the trust, as well as we financed our home through the UMass 5 College Credit Union. It was a very long process, as it was a new thing for this trust. For many decades, there had been no new mortgages on the trust's land, but UMass 5 Credit, sort of mission-driven organization, chose to make this work for them as well. So I have a standard 30-year mortgage, traditional in all those normal ways. But like I said, there has been private loans through the trust. The trust has financed some mortgages in the past, and I think the trust has made its own loans as well as sort of facilitation from outside donors.
About the trust.
Yes, so the trust does, in our lease, the trust does have first option to buy the house when we choose to sell our house. They have first right to refuse, so they have the first in line, they can say no. The option for the trust to purchase the home would be at the fair market appraised value of the house, or as we call it, the improvements. So the house, the septic system, the well, any buildings or structures that we have built or we And that's all at fair market price. So the affordability element comes in with the land value removed. Sort of historically, the largest fluctuations in the price of a single home has been the speculative value of the land. The value of a wooden box hardly changes over time, assuming you don't make any drastic improvements to it. But the value of the land is the thing that the market says changes throughout time.
I think, I'll get you on the stack, but I think you were next.
I live in a little town here in Western Mass that maybe is fairly typical, and we have virtually no affordable housing. And it's expensive. Our taxes are high because we have no businesses in town. And what I'm wondering is what our town could do to attract affordable housing. How would you encourage people to be willing to lease their land through the land trust for somebody else to build a house on? And we have a lot of people who put their land in trust, but it's just to leave it wooded and alone. How would we encourage, Habitat for Humanity to want to build a house on, I assume, a piece of land that gets sold? And what could we do to encourage things like this? I live in Conway.
So we definitely work with local municipalities. I'm waiting for spring town meeting in Shutesbury and Pelham right now for Community Preservation Act funds to acquire land to then build a house on the land. So that has been a great tool for municipalities. If you can get your town to pass CPA funds, that's then funds for affordable housing, recreation, and conservation. So it might appeal to some of the other people who keep conserving their land in your town, but you can also set aside some of that for affordable housing. It also is really great for municipalities to have a housing committee. So having people who are thinking about it and working on it, because you're more likely to know your town better. So the land that came up in Pelham, it was their housing committee that found the parcel. He's talking to the owner. The owner is patient and willing to wait through a long municipal process. There's also the ability of towns to create housing trusts, which is a municipal entity, but it has a little more flexibility to act more quickly than the town meeting process, having to wait once or twice a year.
Any other answers to that question from the room?
Well,
Okay, go ahead.
well, I was thinking, I lived in New York City in the 1970s, and there were still the vestiges of rent control. Rent control was being destroyed, but there were grandfathered apartments. So I lived in a 6-floor walk-up and paid $60 a month. It was a very tiny apartment, but it was rent controlled then. So we see this is the bigger picture, that they've done away with rent control, which kept rents of apartments affordable, and now there's just all this speculation, and so rents are just ridiculously high because there's no public control over how much you can pay for rent. So I would say one political idea would be to bring back some sort of form of rent control.
Is there a response here?
There's, we just redid our zoning bylaws in my town.
Can you speak up?
We just redid our zoning bylaws in my town, and there was this absolutely archaic definition of a family, which the Attorney General let us know was not acceptable. Thank you. But my understanding is that it was a 30-year terror response to the evils of communes. But there's no reason that heteronormative family structure and the production of children needs to be tied with home ownership. And I don't know how many other towns have deep in their bylaws things that prevent a certain number of unrelated individuals from living together. There's no reason for that. We're not dealing with houses of prostitution. We're not dealing with the evils of communes.
If we were.
What town we might be. But there's no reason that related or unrelated individuals should be prevented from entering into home homeownership contracts. There's big, beautiful houses, if we're dealing with our old Victorian housing stock, that needs to be available for people. And there's things that, there's town bylaws that say, well, if you're renting to more than one person, then you've got these insurmountable amounts of money to put in a sprinkler system, to put in individual meter things. So I think on a town by town level, we can look at what are the health codes, what are the building codes, and what are the zoning bylaws that allow multiple adults, consenting adults, to enter into even a more traditional mortgage. But we did just get that changed, and like I said, the Attorney General was like, yeah, you need to do that. So that's what.
What town are you,
Town.
I'm sorry, what town was that?
Money.
Thank you.
Just stop and just get back on the stack again. I think you had a question?
Yeah, I did. I was wondering about, you mentioned Paul from was it Bernardston Country Estates, that the organization you're part of is a for-profit, but with class taxes as if it's like a non-profit or something. So what is that entity type?
Yeah, we are registered with the state as a for-profit corporation.
Okay.
And when we do our taxes, we do them as a club, which I don't know that much about that part of it, but so we only pay taxes on the amount of interest that we make on the money that we have, because I know that it's going to go right back into the community. It's not for profit. We're not going to go out and buy more houses or do more things.
Okay, so the layer of like not having that extra levy of tax just allows you to reinvest it back into the community there.
Yeah, somewhat. Yeah.
I wanted to respond to this young lady's question about rental housing. It just so happens that the panelists work in or are involved in home ownership operations, but nationwide, most of the affordable housing is rental housing, and all affordable housing receives some kind of a subsidy or another to enable it to be cheaper than market rate housing. I'm sure you folks know, I mean, most of the rental housing in the country for low-income people, up to the price limits that you mentioned, up to the 50% level, is through Section 8 certificates that people can use. Either they're tied to the property, or you get one and you can take it around with you to find the landlord. And that subsidizes your rent, but then the property itself, to subsidize the construction of it, it's mainly done by the low-income housing tax credit, which is this mystery that most people don't know about or anything. But if you really want to support rental housing for low-income people, you better make sure they don't cut, that Congress and the President don't cut the low-income housing tax credit, because that enables banks, insurance companies, and corporations to shelter taxes they make in one area by investing in low-income housing, and that finances over a third of all low-income rental housing in the country, the low-income housing tax credit.
Yeah, I think I also sort of want to jump off what I think Elliot said. And I guess my question is more of a comment. And I want to put the thought experiment out there to all of us that we don't really need finance or money to live somewhere. And this idea that we need these elaborate schemes to come up with money to scrape by so that people can just have shelter is something that power is always going to have control over. You know, the banks are always going to have control over it. The elite is always going to have control over it. And what we have in this room and also outside this room is popular power. And so I'm curious about like what the possibilities are for this region for kinds of direct action and grassroots organizing and, you know, building tenants unions, building homeless people's unions. You know, everybody here, like, we, you know, are all in some ways middle class because we had a car or access to a car to come to Greenfield. But, you know, when I'm on the streets in Northampton, I see so many people who are homeless, and it's so cold, and they deserve housing too. And I think we shouldn't have to be paying our lives out for this. So I'm curious what some of our ideas and inspiration are to think outside of those models.
So responses to that, I'm going to start with Elliot. Again.
I mean, I know there was a certain level of controversy pretty recently in Greenfield around the hotel that got demolished, and projects like that where we have this already built infrastructure that could be turned into, like, for example, single occupancy units. But rather than the town investing in creating this affordable housing, they're letting it be demolished or selling it off to, like, another business, or, you know, not taking advantage of what we already have. And I think Greenfield in particular is rich in, like, all of this infrastructure that already exists, that as it declines and as, like, the former owners are trying to get rid of it, like, there's so many ways to come in, and I mean Turner's too, there's so many ways to come in and really make this something that is for the people of the town.
Just a second before I keep going, I just realized I had meant at the beginning to send around a sheet, because I'm thinking if we're starting to talk about organizing, it might be useful to have people's names and contact information. Thanks. And I think you're second, and then yeah, you're on the stack with a question, with a different idea, or to respond to this?
I'm following up on what this brother.
Okay. Stack.
So following up Eleanor's idea about decommodifying housing, in New York City, up until the early 80s, there was a law that if taxes on a privately owned building or apartment were unpaid for 10 years or more, that space was open for squatting. And so I got together with 300 people. We took a city block between 108 and 109 on Amsterdam, the Upper West Side. And Koch sold us the buildings, basically 40 apartments and 5 storefronts, for $1. And now we pay monthly $400 for apartments that would rent on average for $4,000. So there you have a tenfold difference, so you can see the amount of profit that private owners are making, the Trumps of New York are making. And if we had I would like to know if there's any provision in any town or area here, county here, for such a squatting option. Of course, in New York, they closed that door very quickly when they realized that, you know, some people were successfully squatting. That option was closed down. But couldn't we have some kind of measure to occupy basically warehoused and deteriorating living quarters?
So there is a provision for that called adverse possession, but the land values in Nottingham are so high it virtually never comes into play because the legal avenue you have to follow to prove adverse possession is so onerous and the land values are so high it's essentially impossible. There's a provision there though, but it rarely ever comes
25 years of possession.
20, it's like 20, 25 years of possession. It has to be open, notorious, and visible, and you have to be able to basically prove that over that span. Perhaps making the adverse possession law a little less onerous would be an avenue for that. But relatively speaking, land values in New England, even in places like Franklin County, are so high relative to the rest of the country, it just becomes extremely difficult, especially when capital can go wherever it wants to.
Yeah, and then I'll get back to you in a second, because I'm still focusing on, actually, yeah, you too.
We're not talking about the question of whether or not ownership it's necessary. And I'd like to suggest that it isn't, and that maybe some of the things we can do in our communities is figure out ways to make property available for people to live in it without owning it. And I think that local banks is one way that we can pay for those properties or fix them up or do whatever needs to be done if the town takes them over for taxes. They could then be put into a trust and available for people to live in. I know I'm in Wendell, and I know one of the things in my town is the select board does not want to manage property. So a mechanism would have to be developed at the same time to make that pass. But I think that the more we get away from private ownership, the more we get away from the profit motive. And I was surprised that Valley Land Trust has changed the way they figure resale value. Probably 25, 30 years ago, there was a long, long period of time spent negotiating what that resale value could be, and it was tied to the value of the property, the house, how much you put into it, less depreciation, plus any improvements, and that was it. It wasn't market value. And I was surprised they didn't change it.
I can respond to that, yeah. My understanding of the change is the process for some of our longer term homeowners to keep receipts for 25 years of every bucket paint and every 2x4 they purchased, and then to do the actual calculations is a very onerous process. And a few times, sort of the thought experiment got played out, and the number came so close to a market appraisal value that it sort of, my understanding is the switch was made for simplicity and just ability to move.
So, Nikki?
I guess I wanted to speak to your question, sort of. I live on the Valley Community Land Trust also. And we're a very small land trust, and we don't take government money, but there are bigger and sort of maybe more varied land trusts that have more options. Like Burlington, Vermont has the biggest land trust in the country. They have thousands of members, 1,500 apartments and things like that. So they do offer sort of very, very low income housing for like artists, where you can have like a workspace and a home space, sort of in a cooperative like apartment complex and things like that. So some land trusts have just more and more varied options, and just more funds available to help people too. So those are always, and there are over 250 land trusts in the country, so they exist.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry.
What's your name?
Richard.
Richard. I'm in a situation, I live in New Britain, Connecticut, a small, poor city in Connecticut, surrounded by wealthy suburbs. And there's no affordable housing in any of the suburbs. And New Britain is 2/3 affordable housing. Some of it's Section 8, and some of it's because it's a poor city, and they can't charge what you could in Farmington, the neighboring town. So we're in a situation where we have all the poor people in the whole district, and our schools are full of children who come from backgrounds of sorrow and poverty and drug abuse and all of that. And so it really has an impact on our school system. All the neighboring towns, lily white and very expensive. So our goal is to induce them in one way or another to start providing affordable housing, so that everybody who doesn't have a lot of money doesn't just come to New Britain. So it's kind of the opposite of what other people, I don't know if anybody has any experience in that kind of struggle, but we're looking for the neighbors to get some affordable housing so that the entire burden isn't on one central post-industrial decaying city.
I'll get back to you, Richard. Just hold on to that one. I'll take this.
Three things. First of all, I lived in Seattle for a very long time, which actually once was a working class city, a blue collar city, and ain't anymore. There is Section 8, and people who have been on Section 8 for 4, 5, 6 years, they're on the list, but that doesn't mean anything because there aren't places available. Finland, I think it is, has experimented with simply giving people a living wage.
Universal basic income.
Yeah, a universal basic income, I guess is the official term. And all the results aren't in, but they're saying it's actually cheaper to give people enough money to live than it is to try to support them when they can't live with what is. So whether there's something possible that we might think about here is another. And the third thing is that if we in our towns identify our priorities and then work towards them, that makes a difference. If our priority, we identify as a town with our town councils or whatever, that our top priority is housing for people. And we start there. And that's the question. How do we make sure everybody has housing? That changes the conversation than when housing is 15th on the list and we have to do all the other things first. So prioritizing what's important to us as a starting place, and then the question isn't how do we pay for things, it's how do we house people. And we start with that question and work with that as the focus and then figure out all the other steps necessary to meet that primary goal. That might change the conversation some.
Yeah, so I'm hearing a lot of really good proposals. The question I have is what's the institution that we're going to kind of come together to make policy? And that's where I think we need to bring it back to the idea of municipal socialism. And by that I mean general and popular assemblies, which are the place to then make policy. And so we take this conversation and we actually institute it municipally. And so I think we need to start thinking about the first step, which is how do we get an institution where we then make policy from the municipal level?
Richard, and then you.
One thing on yours, and one thing that helps in Massachusetts is 40B, which is a state law. And if any municipality in the state has less than 10% affordable housing, then a developer can come in and by right can develop affordable housing according to 40B, and the neighbors who don't want it can't stop it.
Unless they get a waiver. We have the same thing in Connecticut, and the legislature grants waivers.
Well, that's been very successful here in Massachusetts, and that's the best thing we have, spreading affordable housing around the state so far. But I wanted to mention, I'm not sure how applicable it is because it's Cambridge, where I live. In Cambridge now, to develop a unit of affordable housing costs $500,000. And it's because of the land costs, because Big Pharma has discovered that you're nobody unless you have a lab next to MIT and all this stuff. So the working class got pushed out 50, 60 years ago, most of them. Now the middle class is getting pushed out. And so we formed the Cambridge Residents Alliance, we're doing good, better and better in city council. Every election, we back candidates that don't accept money from developers because developers provide over a third of the total donations to Cambridge city council candidates. We've had great success, and it's only 4 years old, but in 2000, we have inclusionary zoning where a developer is required at their own expense, no public subsidy, to provide, if they build 10 units or more, they have to provide a certain percentage as affordable forever in perpetuity. And we got that requirement increased from 11.5% of the units to 20% of the units. And we have linkage where a developer develops a commercial building, not housing, of more than 5,000 square feet, has to pay into affordable housing fund for every square foot above 35,000. We got that fee increased we got it tripled from $4.35 a square foot to $12 a square foot. Now, we're trying to get an affordable housing overlay that covers the entire city and would open up the ritzy part of town to affordable housing. And since it costs so much, the city is spending its own money, not just money from HUD, CDBG money, and not just, we have the Community Preservation Act, but you have to just spend money from your own regular city budget, the money you get from the parking meters and the property taxes. You have to start spending money subsidizing affordable housing. And so we're hoping to get that subsidy, which is now $3.5 million, increased to $20 million per year. So that's, we're making headway as a community organization. And once you can get your candidate elected, then everybody starts paying attention to you, and the conversation changes.
So finally go John, and then Mike, and you, and then you.
Right, so I'm hearing a gentleman who's clearly had a career in public housing speak and realizing that there's no one from public housing on the panel.
My fault.
No, not necessarily.
Well, I meant to do that, I just didn't.
I think it speaks to sort of larger accidental neglect that we have a tradition of government-controlled housing in this country, that there's no constituency to strengthen right now that's organized in any way. Remember, we're talking about municipal socialism. That need not necessarily mean raising finance at a municipal level. It could be about making use of federal funds to enact social programs. I mean, Vienna, Austria is a model to look to. They have, like, when thinking about these things, I think the municipality is the biggest landlord in the city. It's an international city. They don't do that with their own funds exclusively. They do that in partnership with the federal government. So I'm just, we raise the question of what is the institution that harnesses progress here. I don't think we should ignore what we have, even though it's been, public housing has been, put to the gauntlet in terms of funding and political support, and it's a shell of what it could be. It always has been, actually, since it was developed in the 30s. But my thinking.
That's Mike.
Mike Jackson, writing for the Montague Reporter. I have kind of a comment connected with a question that's going to be a question for Megan. I don't feel like all of the comment is like bearing down on you as a question. It's just you can maybe help us think. I'm hearing a lot of comments and questions so far that kind of are getting at the question of geography and how the movement of capital and also the movement of people are these things that are kind of exogenous. They're outside what any municipality can control. Conrad talking about Manhattan in the 80s and Manhattan now is a pretty good indication of that. And also, talking about how just high right now land prices are in New England wide. And a lot of these things are kind of resonating because, last summer on the Greenfield Town Common, I saw a lot of, I kind of, put a stick in my mouth and bit down as hard as possible and read all the comments that I could find on people's Facebook walls from kind of the anti-side of that to really see where kind of the ideology of get them out, clear them out, get them away, is coming from right now. And what really kind of emerges when you look at that is that there's a lot of people who have a fear of if we, we're on kind of the edge of the system, right, where we have population density is lower, but also is wage density, and so are services like hospitals and schools especially, and the way that like the public school system, they've created a market for that, right, and how that's connected through taxes with land values in different towns. So everyone's in this region is kind of in this system where there's periodically been these economic downturns that pump people into this region, looking for lower cost of living, lower cost of social reproduction, so that we can and I'll include myself, get away with making less money or survive a little more comfortably despite the fact that we're making less money. And because of that, it feels like there's this kind of like built up inoculation against outsiders being able to affordably live here, and that any of kind of these pocket solutions that we can find where we can find a kind of way to make some housing that's relatively more affordable than the market, whether it's a land trust or whether it's even public housing, or whether there's more Section 8 vouchers, going through a town, or rezoning, which we just saw in Montague. I also heard a lot of these residences in the background. So like what I'm wondering is, given that there's just this fear of if we make housing more affordable as just one part of the circuit of the economy, people think that people are going to move here competing for a very small amount of jobs that they're already kind of struggling to hold. I think that I absolutely agree about decommodifying. Clearly advised journalists in this room, but decommodifying housing, decommodifying shelter as a human right. But if we are trying to talk about this as quote unquote municipal socialism and what can be done in an individual place, it really feels like just you're up against this thing where just by making things a little bit better in one place, it's actually the way capital moves and the way people move, not addressing anything. And leaving that there, Megan, as someone who is in an organization that has to go town to town, and I've I think seen you in the town hall in Montague recently even, and trying to talk to abutters and trying to talk to everyone about setting up affordable housing in different towns. Where is kind of the mainstream of the discourse? Where is that argument? And what are the points that you all are making right now to try to convince people that we should create more affordable housing, point blank, because it feels like not everyone here agrees with that.
Well, I think I remember the meeting that we were talking about, and one of our Habitat homeowners in Montague got up and spoke really eloquently about how her life had been changed. But the residents who were the neighbors to about this parcel of land still swayed the committee because there was more of them saying, don't make anything change. So I think that it's a human condition. It's really hard to accept change. We might be in favor of affordable housing as a general concept, but people often push against it when it's in their own neighborhood. There is a local group called Yes in My Backyard, Pioneer Valley. They're the YIMBY folks. In some other larger cities have been problematic because of not playing nice about anti-gentrification stuff. But I think here locally, it's something, it would be one potential way for people to get together on a pro-housing agenda and share information when, like how could more people come to that meeting who were pro-housing? How could I have reached them to say, there's a residential neighborhood next to a school where this town identified land that they could have set aside for housing, but only a couple people came that said, yes, housing is the most important thing to me. Other people, most of the people who came said, we want things to stay the same. So I guess I don't know the answer to your question. Sometimes it's easier. In some towns, at certain times, certain projects are well supported, and it goes smoothly. So I think it's more of a how can we support each other when it's not even our neighborhood, when it's somebody else's neighborhood, it might not feel as urgent. But how can we be a part of supporting affordable housing in our communities across the board, and organizing to do that is important.
In the back, your comment about 40B. So, I want to tie this into your comment about how things actually change, because we do, in Massachusetts, we essentially have the most powerful set of resources available, more or less in the country, to develop affordable housing. 40B is an incredibly powerful option. We have a lot of subsidies and programs that work really well to produce affordable housing. However, those only work really well, generally speaking, if the market conditions in a particular area work really well, because they're predicated upon investments from banks and insurance companies to make those tax credits work. In terms of the local solutions available in the status quo, there are essentially two things that cities and towns in the area could do. And I think I've heard folks mention them generally, but very specifically there's two, and one is to change the zoning to be more dense. You just simply have to change the zoning to be more dense. There's a lot of communities in the region that have multi-acre zoning, and you just can't make affordable housing work on multi-acre zoning. And the second structural barrier that municipalities actually have control over is water and sewer. Water and sewer in Western Massachusetts is the biggest structural barrier to producing affordable housing. Right now, the requirements for septic tanks in the leaching fields associated with them are onerous and frankly outdated. The technology for septic tanks has moved sufficiently enough where we could really shrink the requirements for leaching fields to make more dense developments in places where water and sewer is not available. But if you could make water and sewer available in a municipality in Western Mass, that's the biggest thing you could do. And the second part is in terms of actually changing things in other areas of the state. Resident-owned community development corporations have been the most powerful tool for developing large amounts of affordable housing. But long-term, I don't think this conversation goes anywhere without something we've also been dancing around, which is people just simply need to make more money. We have a labor issue that if there's a cost equation that goes into it and the inputs required to produce housing, rise at a certain level and income does not track with that, so the affordability gap grows over time. And labor, affordable housing is not a thing, it's a relationship between income and expense. And if we are not also talking about labor rights as part of the affordable housing conversation, where we're only really talking about half of the conversation. So there's lots of things we can do with the status quo, but in terms of changing things, I really think labor and affordable housing advocates have to work together to essentially demand more. I mean, we're just going to be richer than it's ever been. We should be getting more.
Mine are more observations than questions. Thank you for that. In Greenfield, we've met Chapter 40B for years and years and years. And we still struggle to provide for or have affordable housing. So we're definitely looking to the communities around us to also begin to solve that problem, and we continue to hope that they do. That's one observation. They're all kind of related. So, as a member of the planning board, following the creation of our sustainable master plan, in fact, I was a member of the planning board. Following the creation of the sustainable master plan, the planning board thought they would do something very simple as a first step towards a possibility of getting more affordable housing into Greenfield. And that was to create an accessory dwelling unit bylaw. We did a fair amount of groundwork. We held many public information sessions, at least 3 at different times of the day so that people could attend. Nighttime, afternoons, noontime, in different locations, the senior center, different places. And still, it was amazing to us and quite shocking to us the number of people who really did not want to see that happen. And all we were saying was, we want to create more density. As a small first step, we want to allow homeowners to create a dwelling unit that within their property, it could be separate, it could be, rebuild a garage, it could be something done well within, you have extra space on your 3rd floor, you own a big, beautiful Victorian, you're getting on in years, your taxes are going up, you need some help with your taxes. Or you have a family, a young family, a daughter or a son and family who want to move in because they can't afford to buy.
So, and you could, or you could create an addition to your house. So it was, we do have it, we did get it, it was a struggle, but it is indicative of some of the things that we have been talking about, the barriers to it, and to creating affordable housing. So I've heard some great ideas, which I've written down. And lastly, a while back, I did a back of the matchbook / on the napkin calculation of what a livable wage in Greenfield would be just to be able to rent an apartment at basically the market rate here. And it is $17 to $19 an hour in Greenfield. So it's about $15 an hour. So that's something that we have to think about. And I don't know the answer to that or how we get that. I mean, there are certainly, I recently left a job making $17 an hour. So there are places in Greenfield that do give that wage and more. But there's plenty that don't and can't afford to. So it's not as easy a question to answer and say, well, of course we ought to be making $15 an hour across the board in our municipality. There's a lot of businesses that we like in town and we frequent in town. I'm thinking mostly about many of our restaurants and whatnot that really couldn't afford $15 an hour for everybody who works for them. So it's you know, it's a conversation that needs to be had, and there is probably a solution somewhere along the way, but it's not an easy conversation any more than this one. That's all.
Was someone in here? Okay.
MIT has a great living wage calculator for every city and town in Massachusetts.
Excellent.
So
Thank you.
So you don't have to do it on the back of your napkin, but also
more good news from Cambridge.
I'm not from Cambridge. Oh yeah, from Cambridge. So my name is Lindsay Sabadosa. I'm from Northampton. Disclaimer: I'm also the state rep from First Hampshire. So I'm really happy to hear a lot of these ideas, and I just want to add one thing. So I live in a city. It's a little bit different from what people have been talking about today, but we do have public housing. And I love when you talked about people power, because we need some people powered help for tenants in public housing, because I think it's a great way to go, but those people are not being listened to at all. We just tried to get greater tenant representation on the housing authority, and it got knocked down from 6 people to 2 people. And we have 13 buildings. So basically, 2 people are going to be considered the voice of the tenants, and otherwise it's not people who live in those buildings. They have no idea what that's like. As well-intentioned as you can be, if it's not your lived experience, you don't know. And I think my office gets complaints all the time. We are constantly reaching out to the housing authority. So yes, public housing, but also we need public uprising to support the people who already live there. The other thing I want to say, I love the YIMBY groups. I go and talk to them a lot. And they're talking about the capital A affordable housing and the lower A affordable housing. So what doesn't actually, get money from the state. And that's great, but it is so complicated to get money from the state for these projects. So in Northampton, we have the lumberyard that's coming up, 55 spaces, hundreds and hundreds of applicants, never going to meet the need, never, just never. And then we have another project coming online that's going to be another drop in the bucket. So I'm really here to kind of hear your ideas. I love this idea about people-owned cooperatives, where we get apartments and not necessarily, places that people have to own, because I think what's going to happen if we don't start to take this seriously is we're just going to be a really old retirement community. Because people can't afford to live, and every time I talk to someone in town, they're like, yeah, I'm moving to East Hampton or Holyoke or up into Franklin County, which love Franklin County, but I'd also like to see some younger people who are able to live in our cities too. So thank you. I guess that's all I'm
Do we have data on the percentage of people who enter affordable housing who leave and purchase their own home?
I'm sure it exists, but I don't have it up here right now.
Yeah.
So what would that tell you?
Excuse me?
What would that tell you?
I'm not sure, I'm not an affordable housing
Well, I just
expert.
wonder where you would go with, once you got that information, why you're asking.
I don't want to embarrass myself, but historically, home ownership has been the means to move into the middle class. And it seems to me that affordable housing concept, paradigm, should be such that it allows or gives people an opportunity to bump up to individual home ownership. And if it doesn't do that, with all due respect, people remain at a set level. Now, there's very little social mobility in this country as it is, if there's any at all anymore. But it would seem to me that besides providing a response to a very, very basic need, shelter, I have a vision of people who enter affordable housing as being born not on first base, not on second base, not on third, but in the dugout. And they need a boost up. And I'm just wondering if there's a way to design or redesign the concept of affordable housing so that it gives people an opportunity that only others have to move into and invest in an individually owned home. That's where I'm coming from.
There are such programs.
Can I make a response to that really quick?
Okay, and then I'll give you.
Yeah, I would argue that tying membership of the middle class to home ownership is how we got into this mess.
Yes.
You didn't do it.
So it's come up a couple of times, but a little bit tangentially, and I just want to underscore the potential of cooperatives to be an avenue for both renters and owners. The cooperative can own a building or act as the tenant, and I think that can be it's a flexible strategy, and it can be done at a variety of scales. I've seen it work even with 5 or 6 people forming a co-op in order to rent a place more affordably. And I think to the extent that we can encourage and support and facilitate that process, because it is sort of a bureaucratic process to incorporate that way, I think that should be part of the discussion.
So I think that Paul's model is there's also a lot of movement to convert manufactured housing parks into cooperatives so that the residents own them. And yours has been around for a really long time.
32 years.
So this is a great model, but part of why it's not happening, manufactured housing has been a market solution to afford the lower A affordable housing that is mostly zoned out in most of our communities. So I live in Franklin County. If anyone else who lives in Franklin County, we live in small towns, and our zoning bylaws are set by each town. So the things that have come up, like small lot zoning, greater density, accessory dwelling units, getting rid of related family member rules, but also allowing manufactured housing in your community are things you can do to make it more open to the ability for someone to maybe own something, either the limited equity co-op or, and make those steps to being able to live in their communities. So we can change zoning in our towns. It's slow, but we can do it.
So there's someone, I'm just going to go to someone who hasn't spoken yet.
I just wanted to speak to that zoning question. I'm on the Planning and Zoning Commission in a small town in Connecticut, Bethany. And we are working on a regulation whereby we're calling it attainable housing overlay zone, which would mean in that area, and normally the zoning is 1.5 acres or 3 acres for a house, depending on your proximity to the public water. So this would allow up to 6 units on an acre, and the attractive thing to a developer would be you can put in 6 units. It's an incremental thing, but we're getting supportive folks because in town, kids can't live there once they, want to leave and find a place. Senior citizens, there's no place to go to. So we're actually getting fairly good bipartisan support on that, and believe me, I'm the only socialist there. It's not like there's a lot of advanced thinking, but the attainable housing overlay zone seems to be one way to get around it.
Oh, yeah, please.
So I just wanted to, I'm really glad we're talking about zoning because I really think that's one of the keys to, take control over how our communities are developed. But I would really encourage us all to think about reframing the language of this conference called municipal socialism. What we're talking about here is a reclamation of something that the United States has long held dear, which is a protection of the commons. We are protecting the commons. When we talk about zoning, that's something we all hold in common. It's our power, it belongs to all of us. Whether we can put things that have been transferred out of the commons back into the commons doesn't mean it's socialism. We can put back in things like housing interest, banking. That is something that we all own. We own, we have that in common anyway, there's lots of things, but I just want to encourage us to think outside of this. Municipal socialism is going to be fiercely resisted, and if you go in front of your town, these conservative towns, and you say, oh, municipal socialism, you're invoking a whole political barrage of things that have no place in our understanding of how we live and operate. So I would encourage us to rethink that, call it the commons, call it something else, call it what it really is, because we are not socialists. And our law protects private property rights. And that's a huge obstacle to what we are, a lot of things. But we can make differences. We can do zoning. I just wanted to just say there's overlay districts. There's in New Salem, we allowed accessory apartment. We took care of the problems with the elderly moving out of our communities. We took care of the problem with people being able to live, young families being able to live in our communities. They can now. Just by that one zoning change, you don't have to make density widespread. You can make pockets where it makes sense in village centers where it traditionally was. We can go back to, if you use terms like traditional, things that we've always held as important values. I think that the language is important here. If you want to move forward, I'm just suggesting, be careful how you use the word socialism. Okay, because you're not talking about a socialist government here. We're talking about very small incremental changes or major changes by just changing things out, putting them back in the commons. That's the right term to use. I think that's all.
I want to respond directly to that, to put point on it, that I've heard a word that changes from affordable to attainable, which might be a piece of language that might be widely acceptable. And if we're talking about taking very politically diverse communities like Greenfield and pushing an idea that would create resistance, perhaps with the word sociable, looking for terms like that would be very useful.
Well, okay, just to, I guess, state the obvious, but to state it, I mean, when you deal with any one small section of the much larger issue, we're going to run into, we're talking about capitalism, right? And so municipal socialism, if we're trying to look at housing without looking at the other issues, we're going to run up against what we're running up against. So thinking about the ways in which we have to broaden the conversation beyond housing, to healthcare, to, all the other issues that impact whether we have the ability to provide housing or to attain housing for everyone. I think we have to keep in mind that we're dealing with capitalism that works against this. I'm wondering if there are ways we can broaden our impact by connecting across communities. I look at school districts that one by one each deal with their funding issues alone as if they're the only ones in the room, when we have a common problem across all of our communities. Housing is a common problem across all of our communities, and so thinking about ways we can both pool our influence and our resources together and identify what we're dealing with as a common problem rather than how can we fix this in Greenfield and how can we fix this in Conway and how can we fix. It's a common issue, right? So thinking about ways we can work together across those community boundaries and recognize we're dealing with spreading socialism. And socialism is, I think, not a word we should run from. But to say, yeah, And what does socialism mean? It means pooling our resources for the good of everybody. So I'm okay with that.
Will, who hasn't spoken yet, and then David.
Thank you. One of the things I think we need to bear in mind is the power of reaction against what we're trying to do. And just one simple example, back when I was on the town council and several generations ago, and we tried to get rent review in Greenfield. We started talking about rent control. And of course, the hackles went up all over the city on that. And the council said, well, we need to establish at least some kind of moderate rent review so that rents weren't constantly going up and up and up and creating unaffordable housing. And we had a good proposal going on, and what happened in the next election? The Landlords Association took over the council. And the thing was dead. And then, as soon as that issue was finished, they kind of disappeared. And we were left with a partial council. So that the forces of reaction against anything we're going to try to do are so powerful that, because we are fighting against the whole capitalist structure. And I don't know how we counter that either, peacefully.
We're growing.
Yeah, I just wanted to circle back around to this topic of the word affordability and what it implies and what might be some better alternatives like attainability. And so I'm just sort of echoing what some other folks have said. And I think it's really important to interrogate this concept of affordability because I think its relevance is rapidly melting in our current political environment. And it's based on so many assumptions, like what is affordable is based on so many assumptions like how much money you're making. Also heteronormativity and this idea of the family where there's a man who's out there being the breadwinner and there's a woman at home reproducing the household. And and I think the problem with this concept of affordability is very insidious because it implies that if you don't have, say we have all the affordable housing in the world, and it implies that if you don't have it, it's your fault. If there's affordable housing, well, why don't you, if you don't have housing, well, it must be your fault. You didn't go out and get the right job. You didn't go out and set up your finances in the appropriate way. And I think these ideas of what was affordable 30 years ago, I think when many people here were buying their homes or, settling into their housing situations, like that's just not, it doesn't exist anymore. I think of the kinds of affordable housing that are available now. I know to me as a young person, and I would anticipate many of the other young people in this room, like has never been attainable at all. Mm-hmm. It's this kind of far-flung dream. Like the idea of getting into public housing sounds amazing. I would love that, but I never even consider it as a realistic possibility. Like that's where we're at. Mm-hmm. So I think this concept of affordability kind of needs to make way for something new, better.
I just wanted to bring up the ideas of municipal socialism and how politically problematic that might be in terms of organizing and actually getting things passed. And I think it's an idea and it carries with it certain aspects. But what you're talking about, I think, is important, which is the ideas of socialism in America can get problematized. And that's where we need to ask ourselves, are we doing this through a state or are we doing this through assemblies? And so it comes back to not so much what we're calling it, but as much as how we're doing it. And I really want us to, I don't really care what we call it, but we really need to ask ourselves, are we going to do this by voting or are we going to do this by something else?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, combining that with Jim's comment, because I think this government and our corporatized businesses have made the S word such a dirty word to be afraid of. And I've just been spending a lot of the last 2 weeks learning about Venezuela. I've known for a long time about Cuba. Cuba doesn't have housing problem. I mean, nobody's homeless in Cuba. They have such good educational and under their socialism and health care. They can offer health care to people in other countries. They offered emergency aid to the U.S. when the Katrina happened, and we said, no way. So it's like, this is a problem, and the only way I see is for people to organize together. And we've heard a lot of that about how these people have organized together and done really good things. But we're fighting a system, and the U.S. is prepared not only to wipe out Venezuela for all the gains that they've made, using sanctions, and that wasn't enough, so now they're threatening war, and when they finish with Venezuela, they'll take their oil, and then they'll go after Cuba for being successful. And it's really scary, but it's going to take a lot of people organizing together for the commons, for protecting our communities, and realizing that only in community are we going to survive. And that's what indigenous people knew. You had to have community, you had to have sharing and cooperation, and you didn't need a lot of money. You just needed to know how to live together.
So I'm going to bump someone who hasn't spoken yet, and you, and then I'll get back to the.
I just wanted to piggyback off of what Leon was saying, and also to address your point. Like, I also don't. It's not important what we call it. Like, I would consider myself like an anti-capitalist, a Marxist, but that doesn't mean that I need to put like a sickle and hammer on my on my shirt. Not that I think that's bad, but I think it's important because it provides us tools of analysis for understanding the economic structure that we're moving through. I still think we need to understand the current conjuncture and where we have room to struggle. But I do think that that's important, at least for me, because it provides me a framework for how to zoom out and view the bigger structural issues. That doesn't mean that I need to necessarily, get a rifle or whatever to go to the mountains, So, that's I guess all I wanted to say. I mean, it helps. I think it helps provide answers, and it helps us understand what we're against, so we can figure out what we're for and how to get there. But I mean, the commons, is a good word to I don't know, George Monbiot wrote a good,
So I just want to get back to what Doug said earlier about pooling influence and resources across towns and not to use these somewhat artificial town boundaries that we have. So to me, that says CPR, because that's what CPR is a county-wide, multi-issue organization that until now has not had a housing group. We have task forces on all these other issues, but not housing. So I'm hoping that that's something that can come out of this discussion and out of this energy in this room. And I know there was a sign-up sheet going around, and we'll...
Yeah, we didn't
get it.
Where the sign-up sheet ended?
Somewhere down there.
There's a clipboard. There's a clipboard, sign-up sheet.
Anyone see it?
Is this so? Do you have that?
No.
No, you don't. I don't know who says that.
Somebody said that.
Last time I saw it went that way.
It went that way, yeah.
The FBI.
Uh-oh, we're gonna have a hard time organizing.
Hey, that was last.
Yeah, no, we have the emails of everybody who registered for the conference.
So we can send out that. We can do that anyway, but it'll appear, I think, when we clear out.
We don't even.
Yeah, I can't get away from thinking about, there are things that are rights to human beings. Housing is one of them, being able to eat is another, medical care is another. Water is another. So I'm really adverse to profit in housing. And one of the concepts of a land trust was that the increase in value of the land came from the community, not from the person living on that land. It came from the efforts of all the people in that community to make the community what it was. And I mean the whole town, or maybe even the county. And so that's why they couldn't the land was taken out of that financial equation, so that the concept was that the person that bought the property next would have more time to give back to the community because they were spending less time working to pay for their property. But I just don't think, I think there needs to be a way to take the profit motive out of housing. I don't understand why. I have a friend who owned housing and resold housing, and she was complaining because she was selling the house she lived in, and she was only going to get like $10,000 more than what she paid for it. And I said, so you're upset because somebody's not going to pay for the housing that you lived in for the past 10 years. They're not going to pay your rent for the past 10 years. And she said, yeah. And that just, oh.
Scott, we're at 11 o'clock.
Okay, one last comment.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I urge people to go to Google, go to what's that outfit that does the surveys of,
Survey month.
No, but anyway, there's a survey every 5 years. What do you think? What's your feeling about the word socialism? And every 5 years, for the last 25 years, it's been improving. Over 50% of the people in the United States now have a positive idea about the notion of socialism. 20 years ago, no. In some of our communities, it's also unequal ideological development. In some communities, you got to be very careful to stay away from that word. In other communities, you do not. And we need to, don't be stuck. We had a landlord revolt in my town too, about 4 or 5 years ago. But the reaction to the reaction is growing. And the communities that had bad housing, that wanted to have the city do something about it, but the landlord came in and squashed us and took over the city council, those communities are mobilizing right now. So don't think that the idea of socialism is dead. It's growing, it's stronger than it has been in 2 generations.
I'd like to, Aaron, anyone else on the panel, if you have any final comments?
Yeah, the list has been found, so if you haven't signed on.
So just one closing thought I've got in this moment. I'm hearing a lot of great ideas, a lot of really great initiative and desire from a lot of people, and something that's really resonated with me is the notion of responsibility. You hear a lot from the other side about individual responsibility and everything. And I've personally chosen to flip that around and take my personal responsibility as someone who's been able to create resources in my life and all these things, to take the personal responsibility to commit radical anti-capitalist action, choosing the way in which I live, doing things with intention. A room of people who I'm guessing are pretty intentioned and want to live that way. So the power is there, available for us all in the ways we choose to live our lives.
Yeah, what I'm hearing about everybody, I think the idea of cooperatives is a great thing, and I think a lot more people should expand on that. You can get a group of people together, buy a large house, renovate it, have common areas, and still won't pay a fraction of what it would be to live anywhere else. And I think that's something that you're going to see going on. It's just like starting a company. You got to start from the beginning and get a bunch of like-minded people together and start a cooperative and maybe invest in your own properties.
I'm just really excited by all the sort of people-powered ideas that we're talking about today at multiple different scales. So I would encourage everyone to figure out what the next thing you're going to do is, whether it's spending one day with Habitat for Humanity, whether it's starting a co-op, whether it's joining a community land trust, your local zoning or planning board to change just showing up to a public meeting in your town, or organizing rent control. You know, I mean, there's a housing union. There's a lot of different things that need to be done. So take one step today because you can plug in at many different levels.